My business is called Sound Media. It's an audio marketing business. What you really need to know is that I've always loved audio. That's the important bit. So I did my first radio show at the age of 14. Some of you might have seen this photo before, I don't know. I've put it on LinkedIn before. There is proof of me doing a radio show at 14. This is why I wanted the lights down. You don't want to miss this glorious moment of me in a radio studio at the age of 14 wearing a garbage t-shirt. I mean, it's all downhill from this. Is the best bit of the whole talk, believe me. But yeah, so first radio show when I was 14, and always obsessed with radio, always obsessed with audio. These are some of the radio stations that I've worked on during my kind of broadcasting career. Den FM, which was based not far up the road from here in Bart Green in Barnsley, and then some other local stations as well. Most recently worked at BBC Radio Sheffield, where I still do some freelance work now. In fact, I was there last weekend just gone doing the news bulletins. So if you get bored on your way home, you want to stick iPlayer on or BBC Sounds and listen back to Radio Sheffield at the weekend, you'll hear me waffling on the news. So basically, this is pretty much what I've always done for a living. It's talking, it's audio. I started podcasting myself about 10 years ago now. Initially just as a bit of fun. One thing led to another, and ultimately this led to me starting my own little audio business in 2020, which I then rebranded in 2021 as Sound Media. And that is what I do now. So what does Sound Media do? What's this all about? It's basically helping people with the stuff that I'm going to go on to talk to you about in the next quarter of an hour or so. So it's kind of the idea of podcasting for your business or for your personal brand. Although, slightly confusingly, I tend not to call it podcasting that much anymore. I tend to refer to audio marketing. Generally, when I ask that, people just say, James, isn't that just podcasting? And it kind of is. And here's kind of my justification as to why I've started referring to audio marketing rather than podcasting. This is kind of similar to when you think about social media. Some people will use Facebook to tell some really bad dad jokes or post pictures of last night's meal or whatever. They're perhaps a little bit less serious in the way that they approach social media, whereas some people use it as a very well-defined tool to help them with whatever they're kind of working on, whatever they're trying to achieve. Podcasting's now at the size where it's sort of similar. So there's people that use podcasting to have a bit of fun, to mess around, to do something that they're passionate about and they enjoy doing. But then there's people that use podcasting as a much more kind of serious tool. How I break that down is that we've got this big thing called podcasting. And within that, we've got this smaller subsection that I call purposeful podcasting. So that's people that are using podcasting a little bit more seriously. They've got a real idea as to what it is that they're trying to achieve by creating audio content. So it's that bit more purposeful. And then within that subsection, again, we've got this little kind of corner of the market, which I call audio marketing. I'm not sure it's an accepted phrase. It's kind of something that I made up, but hopefully it makes some kind of sense. So it is using audio as a form of marketing. It's not designed to be a standalone marketing output. It's not something that people should do and then go, brilliant, I've got a marketing plan. It's part of a wider marketing strategy, and that's why what Colette was talking about is really important, because I think that audio can fit alongside the other forms of content, the other marketing that people are doing really well. So it fits really neatly alongside things like blogging and video and kind of image creation, fits well alongside social media, fits well alongside physical marketing and things like networking. Obviously, you guys here today, we're all kind of having a chat before we got going. But people tend not to think about audio as a potential part of their marketing plan, and that's something that I want to go on to talk about a little bit. So let's just cover off this thing about, I realise I'm an audio guy and I stand in front of people and go, audio's brilliant. And then people go, yeah, but why? Why is audio so good? Like, you've not really sold this thing to me. You're just an excited guy talking about audio. So I'm just going to talk for a couple of minutes about why I think audio is so brilliant and so powerful, and why I think it has something kind of unique over the other forms of content that people create. So firstly, audio is super engaging. It's a really engaging way to communicate with an audience, and we've probably all got an audience that we're trying to talk to, that we're trying to get in front of, that we're trying to engage with. Probably know the kind of people that we're all looking to get in front of. Audio does it in a way that's really, really personal. So most content that you create these days, most content that you consume these days, there's a screen, isn't there? It involves, in some way or another, you're looking at a screen. We're kind of doing it now, looking at a big screen on the wall. But yeah, most content that we consume, social media, video, it all does involve looking at a screen, and that's fine. But audio gives an opportunity to remove that screen and take that away. And so I think with that comes something that's really personal. It's an opportunity to put kind of your voice and your words straight into someone's brain, straight into their ears and straight into their brain. Most people would listen to a podcast on a pair of headphones. They tend not to play it out loud. Earphones, AirPods, something like that. So I think it's kind of unique in the fact that it has that really quite personal kind of connection that it makes with people. And with that comes the opportunity to really start to build trust with someone, really build that engagement with someone. Sort of hinted at this when we were in that little bit there, but one of the great things about podcasting is that people do tend to listen on earphones. It kind of means that you can listen to a podcast anywhere. So you can listen to a podcast when you're in the gym, when you're going for a run, when you're out for a walk, when you're in the supermarket doing your shopping, you can be listening to a podcast. When you're on a train commuting, you can listen to a podcast. When you're driving the car as well, probably not on earphones, but a lot of people on their morning commute will stick on a podcast. And we'll talk a little bit about how video and podcasting can work together later on. But of course, you would struggle to watch a YouTube video while you're driving a car, but you can listen to a podcast while you're driving a car. So I think there's something really powerful in the fact that you can listen anywhere, you can listen while you're doing something else. Podcasting also gives us this opportunity, audio marketing gives us this opportunity to be really quite niche. And what I mean is that you could be really passionate about the most obscure things, and podcasting gives you that opportunity to talk about that and to be super niche. And what I mean is, if you go back to the 90s, if you were really passionate about something, you couldn't walk into a radio station and say, I'm really passionate about this thing, would you let me on the radio to talk about it? They'd throw you out of the building. Anyone can start a podcast about anything. And that opportunity to be super niche is quite powerful from a business perspective. No one's ever listened to a podcast and afterwards said, God, that was really boring, I wasn't interested in that topic at all. Because why would they have pressed play on it? Why would they listen to it in the first place? So people choose to listen to a particular podcast. And most forms of marketing are kind of about trying to force your way in front of people when they're not really expecting it. Social media marketing is about trying to get your message in front of people who've actually gone to social media for something else. But it's a little bit different in terms of audio because people choose to press play on the podcast that they want to listen to. They've decided that they're interested in that subject and they're going to listen to it. Podcast SEO is quite an interesting subject. If anyone's interested in SEO and kind of follows developments in kind of the Google world and stuff, but suffice to say, podcast SEO is a really good opportunity. Of course, podcasting works really well in terms of thought leadership. So it's a really good opportunity to position yourself as the conversation leader in your space, really, in the industry that you're in. Quite literally, you can become the conversation leader. You are leading the conversation in the audio content that you produce. There's a whole thing around guests as well. I'm going to come on to that in a few minutes. I also think sometimes it's just easier to get things across with your voice. And I'd imagine we've probably all been partway through typing an email or writing a message to someone, and you think, oh, do you know what, I'm just going to ring them. It's just easier to get things across using your voice. You can't be misinterpreted when you're saying something. And that's one of the differences, I think, between creating audio content and using things like social media, where there isn't really a tone of voice. You can really get across what you're trying to do. And it also gives your audience an opportunity to use their imagination a little bit, which not very much stuff does now. So I bought a house in January, and I could now put a picture of my house on the screen and you'd all go, it's a house. Or what I could do is I could try and describe it to you. I could tell you a little bit about my house, and you can build up your own picture of it. So you can decide what street it's on. Might be the street that you grew up on, or might be the last street that you walked down. I can give you some kind of bits, but you can form your own picture. You can use your imagination. In radio, we used to call this theatre of the mind. The idea that you can give people a bit, but they do the hard work themselves and build up that picture, which not very much stuff does now. When something happens, like the other day when we had that big eclipse, literally within seconds, I got notifications from news apps on my phone with pictures of it. Didn't need to try and imagine it. It was right there in front of me. Some of the time that's brilliant. Some of the time quite nice to be able to just use our imaginations a little bit and build up our own pictures. Audio gives people an opportunity to do that. And I think that's one of the reasons podcast listening is really, really popular. So that's a bit about why I think audio is brilliant. Normally at this point, the next question that people ask me is, or the next thing that people kind of say is, brilliant, James, fantastic, yeah, podcasting, brilliant, but everyone's doing it, aren't they? There's no point me getting involved in podcasting because everyone's already doing it. Well, I've got a couple of responses to this. So I genuinely believe that podcasting is still relatively quite small, pretty tiny in comparison to things like social media. You compare it to the number of videos that's on YouTube, the size of the internet, which is the comparison when we're talking about creating blogs and written content. Podcasting is really small at the side of those, but absolutely, there's no denying the fact that podcasting has grown hugely over the last certainly 3 or 4 years. Through the COVID years, there was a massive explosion in the number of people who started podcasting. So at this point, I want to introduce you to a thing that I call James's 5% theory. It's pretty simple. This doesn't involve swearing, so if you're easily offended, look away now. The theory goes like this. 95% of podcasts are shite. So 95% of podcasts out there, this is a made up stat by the way, but I reckon it's pretty accurate. The vast majority of podcasts are just not very good. And that might be they're really not clear on who it is that they're trying to talk to. It could be the sound quality is just rubbish. It sounds like they're recorded with their head stuck down the toilet or something like that. So I call that 95%, I call that the noise. And most people who start creating audio content just enter that noise, and they're just in competition with other people in the noise. So you've probably worked out my 5% theory actually is that there are about 5% of podcasts that are doing a really I'm going to run through now what I've put together as 10 golden rules of purposeful podcasting. So I think purposeful podcasting is basically that 5% of people that really know what they're doing, that are doing a really, really great job with the audio that they create. Just to provide at this point, there aren't just 10 golden rules. There's a lot more. There's loads of different kind of elements to audio creation. I'm certainly not saying that there's only 10, and they're not in any particular order. These are just 10 things that I want to highlight. And if one or two of them kind of connect with you, engage with you, get you thinking a little bit about how maybe something like audio creation might work for you, then that's my job done really, really well. I did say they're not in any particular order, but I do think that number one is the most important. Hoping you can see that there. So that says strategy is vital. I think it is the work that people do before they pick up a microphone that makes or breaks the success of the podcast that they create, of the audio that they create. There's a very good theory, which is that done is better than perfect, and I think that works for some things. I don't think it works for podcasting, because people that just wing it, that just go, I'm just going to pick up a microphone, see what happens, see what comes out, we'll see what comes at the end of it, they're going in the 95%, because they're just not clear in terms of what it is that they're looking to achieve and who it is that they're trying to communicate and talk to. So it's really important to have a clear strategy. I think there's two main strands to a strategy, and they are real clarity in terms of what it is that you're trying to achieve from creating audio. Just saying, I just want listeners, that's not good enough. You need to be really clear in terms of why are you doing this? How is this going to support the other content that you create? How is it going to help you achieve this overall goal that you're working to in your work life, in your business, whatever that might look like? The other is something that I've said a few times, which is who you're talking to. Who's the audience that you're trying to engage with? Who's the person that you're trying to connect with? You really need to know that before you sit down in front of a microphone, because if you know who it is that you're talking to, you can just talk to them. It really is that simple. I think strategy is also when it becomes really key to figure out where podcasting fits in alongside the other marketing that people are already doing. So podcasting shouldn't really just stand alone as its own little thing, because every podcast can be repurposed as a blog, probably as a transcript on your website. Things like how you use clips from the podcast, how you create other kind of little snippets of content to use as things like shorts and things like that. All that needs a strategy to tie all that together. So I think strategy is really sound quality is important, but it isn't everything. So you've got to hit a certain level in terms of sound quality. People that record podcasts on Zoom, I don't think is good enough anymore. Sticking a mic in the middle of a table with 4 or 5 people sat around talking, I don't think is good enough anymore. I think they're kind of fine if you're happy being in the 95%, but to get into that 5%, you've got to hit a certain level in terms of sound quality. But much above that level is not really going to make a whole deal of difference. So do you need a completely soundproofed studio? No, you don't. You need to hit that certain level, but going beyond that is not really going to win you any listeners. People who obsess over sound quality and all the different equipment and things that they're going to buy, and buying like bits of foam to go on the wall and stuff like that, they often end up forgetting golden rule number 2. They take their eye off the ball in terms of remembering it's all about the content, and that's where most of the time and the effort should go. Just to put some kind of context around that, I don't think anyone's ever listened to a podcast and at the end of it said, God, well that was really boring, but the sound quality was brilliant. That's never happened, and it's never going to happen. Number 5, don't try to live out your dream of being a radio DJ. Sometimes something weird happens when you sit someone in front of a microphone and they turn into a prick, right? I've seen it happen. Seen it happen many times. People who are quite engaging, the way their talk's really good, and you sit them down in front of a microphone and they go, "Hey, how are you all doing today? Good to have you with us." They just turn into an idiot, right? Be yourself. If you've got you're harboring this, childhood desire to be a radio DJ, podcasting is not going to be the place to live that out. It can be if you're happy to be in that 95%, but if you want to be in the 5%, you've got to be yourself. You've got to talk to people in the way that you would do normally. So I always say to people, this is not the stage, this is not the place to live out that childhood dream of being a radio presenter. A little bit of content advice here when it comes to podcasting. I'll elaborate a little bit on what I mean here. So make the intro tight and make the ending neat and tidy. Look, when you're doing a podcast, chances are most people will do a podcast with a guest, someone else that they're chatting to. And chatting to people is something that we're doing all day, every day anyway. So actually, once you get talking to someone, once you get into that conversation, it's normally, that works pretty well. That most people are fine with that. The stuff that people struggle with is the unnatural bits of a podcast episode. That's usually the bit at the beginning when you've got to kind of introduce it, set it up, bring the guest in. Once you get talking, it's fine, and then it gets to the end, and again, people find that quite awkward at the end. I've heard quite a few podcasts that are similar to kind of like a couple of love-struck teenagers at the end of a phone call where they're like, "Right, bye then, thanks then, bye, see ya, bye." And it's just really, really clumsy. And the reason this stuff matters, particularly the ending, is someone's listened to the whole of your podcast, they've been really engaged by you, but they'll remember the ending because it's the last bit that they've heard. So if that's just really clumsy and not as neat and tidy and not as well thought out as the rest of the episode, that can stick in people's minds. So the key thing is, at the beginning, just keep it nice and tight. Set up who you are, who your guest is, what you're going to be talking about. Don't ask people what they got up to at the weekend and how they are and stuff like that. People don't care. They're listening to that podcast episode for a reason, either because they find the guest interesting or because it's about a topic or a subject that they're really interested in. They're not bothered about that little bit of chit chat at the beginning. So that's why I say keep the intro nice and tight. I have a kind of a golden rule in terms of what I work towards. If an episode if you've enjoyed this, if you want to find out more about me, here's my website address, or find my LinkedIn profile in the show notes, something like that, and then just wrap it up with a nice kind of goodbye, see you next time, something like that. If you don't plan this stuff and have quite a clumsy intro, quite a clumsy outro, that can be the difference between a podcast that's in the 5% and in the 95%. This actually links a little bit to point number 5. It's weird when it's written down. Remember, people only have one pair of ears. Of course they do. But a bit of a bugbear of mine when I hear people that do podcasts and they say things like, "Hello to all the listeners. How are you all doing today?" People can't listen on behalf of anyone else, right? People have only got one pair of ears. It doesn't matter how many people are listening. You can only speak to one person on a podcast episode. They can only listen for themselves. So all that kind of trying to make it sound like there's lots of people listening, it baffles me. How are you today? Thank you for listening. Thank you for joining me. I'm going to talk to you about such and such, right? You can connect with people. You can put your arm around your listener and just talk directly to them. Then you introduce your guest. Now we're going to introduce so-and-so. Like, it's just you and the listener. And yet people kind of talk in this way to try and make it sound like there's lots of people listening. They don't care. Listeners don't care how many other people are listening. That golden opportunity to make a real one-to-one personal connection with people. for failing to prepare is preparing to fail. So I think this is really relevant when it comes to podcasting, partly because of that point we mentioned earlier about the intro and the outro. That needs planning, that needs thought in advance. But I also think doesn't matter how well you know a subject, doesn't matter how experienced you are in terms of doing this stuff, if you've got a guest, you should prepare a list of questions in advance. I've been doing, I missed this off the intro a bit earlier on, but I started out as a newspaper journalist for the first 4 years of my career before I then moved into radio journalism in terms of my adult working life. But interviewing people is what I've been doing since the age of 18. It's what I've done for longer than I would care to remember. And yet every time I do a podcast interview, I'll sit down in advance and think, what questions am I going to ask this person? And I'll have that list with me when I sit down with them to do that podcast episode. And the reason being is that you never quite know what someone's going to say. And if you don't prepare questions in advance, you might know the first question that you're going to ask someone. And then as they're answering that, as they're talking, your brain starts panicking. You start thinking, right, what am I going to ask them next? What else did I want to know from them? And they might drop in this amazing little like golden nugget of information or something that they never told anyone before, that they never mentioned before, and you don't hear it because you're busy worrying about what you're going to ask next. So having a list of questions in front of you allows you to just concentrate on what the other person's saying. It allows you to really listen to what they're saying. That's what your audience is doing. They're listening to the other person. And I had this with a guest that I had for an interview about a month ago or so, and they were talking about something, and they said, and then when I lived in Peru for a year and this happened, and then they moved on to something else, and they just slightly referred to it, and I obviously I heard it because I was listening to what they were saying, so I went back to it and said, why did you live in Peru for a year? And it was a really interesting story, and I could have missed that if I was too busy panicking about what am I going to ask them next. So never get so complacent that you think, oh, I can wing this, I don't need to prepare questions in advance. Always prepare a list of questions in advance. It doesn't matter if you ask the first one and they say something interesting and you go off topic and you don't ask any of the questions on that list. That's fine, doesn't matter. But knowing that you've got it, you've got that security in front of you in terms of things that you can ask, just allows you to really listen to what the person that you're talking to is saying. Number 9, really make the most of your guests. So this is a point generally about guest strategy, and there's a few different aspects to this. First of all, if you're doing a podcast that's about the space that you're in, the industry that you work in, you can obviously approach pretty much anyone that you want and ask them if they'd like to come on your podcast and talk about the thing that they know. Now, there may be people that you've been trying to get in front of, maybe trying to have a meeting with. You might have sent them a couple of messages on LinkedIn, asked whether or not they'd be up for a chat, and they've never really responded to you. People who are maybe quite high up in really senior positions or are seen as sort of influencers in that space, who might not respond to those messages saying, hey, could we meet up for a coffee and have a chat? But if you say to them, I'm doing a podcast episode about X, and I think you're the absolute expert when it comes to that topic, there's no one else that I want to get on talking about that, would you come on and discuss it with me? I think chances are there's a really good chance that people will say yes to that, because why wouldn't they? It's a chance for them to kind of sell and talk about what they do and talk about themselves. People like talking about themselves. So you can be really strategic in terms of who it is that you invite as a guest on your podcast. This is before you even start thinking about who's going to listen to it. This is just about getting yourself in a room, behind a desk, on a call online, whatever it might be, with some people that you'd really like them to know who you are. There's a lot of powerful stuff that can come from that, by the way, because it's a bit weird for me because I sell podcasting, so going and sitting down with people and recording a podcast episode with them is also kind of selling what I do to that person, and it's really not unusual for someone that I've done this with. It can be months, sometimes even years later, that I get a message from them saying, James, can you pop back and see us, because we're thinking about starting our own podcast, we wondered if you might be able to help us. So it's almost like a little bit like Inception in some ways, kind of planting this seed into people's minds about who you are and what you do, but it just allows you to get in front of some really interesting people. The other thing that's great about having guests on a podcast is that they will have their own audience, so they can do quite a lot of the hard work in terms of helping you pull in new listeners, but you've got to give them the tools to do that. So any guest that you have on, make sure that you're sending them the link so that they can promote the podcast to their audience, to their followers on LinkedIn, to their email lists. Send them clips, ask them if there's anything else that they'd like, if there's anything that that they need to be able to go about promoting it. If you don't ask them, they don't necessarily do it off their own back. So having a bit of a strategy there, having a little bit of a process about how you make the absolute most of your guests is really key in making a podcast that's going to be successful. And number 10, this point's a bit of a hard sell to people sometimes. I don't think that purposeful podcasting is a hard and fast numbers game. People obsess over how many downloads they've got, how many listeners that they've got to a podcast, and they think it's all about just getting as many people as possible. Opportunity to create quite niche content that's about a subject that the vast majority of people would find really boring, and that's fine because you're not trying to engage with the vast majority of people. It's designed to engage with quite a small, quite a niche audience. So that means that a really effective podcast that does a really good job might actually have quite a limited target audience. But it can be a really engaged audience. So for me, I think having 20 really engaged regular listeners who really give a damn about what you're talking about, they're really engaged with the content that you're creating, and ultimately there's a pretty good chance that they'll go on to become a customer or a client or whatever it is that you'd like them to do. That having 20 of those is better than having 20,000 listeners that don't really give a toss about who you are and what you do. So really niched content with a really kind of small but engaged audience is where you can win. And don't forget as well, every person that listens to a podcast is a real person. So people go, I've got 200 listeners. That's 200 people who've got names, they've got lives, they've got jobs, they've got families, they've got other things going on in their life. They've got millions and millions of bits of content trying to get their attention every day, and they choose to listen to your podcast. Of those millions and millions of other things that are vying for their attention, they engage with your podcast. So I think whatever that number looks like, it's brilliant that it's not zero. Like, we should all probably expect to get zero. We think, why would anyone listen to us over all the other stuff that's out there? So my point is, don't obsess too much about going brute force, trying to just get as many listeners as possible for the sake of it. Be really targeted about who it is that you're trying to engage with, and that might mean it's a smaller number, but that number can be better. Now, I've also got what I refer to as my golden mantra of purposeful podcasting. And this is something that I keep going back to a lot with people, because ultimately it's true. And that is this. A great podcast is actually just a great conversation. People get really bogged down in a lot of the stuff that even I've touched on and talked about there in terms of equipment, in terms of sound quality, in terms of things like processors and things like that. But ultimately, this year, by the way, is the 20th anniversary of podcasting. Podcasting first became a thing in 2004. I would class that as still being relatively new, I guess, 20 years old, particularly in the UK, maybe 15 years or so that podcasting's been a thing. Having conversations was not invented in 2004. Having conversations is something that we've been doing for a long time. Podcasting came along and became a way, it's a platform, it's an outlet, it's a way for us to have those conversations and make them available for other people to listen to in a really easy, quite cost-effective way of being able to do that at scale. But a great podcast is still just a great conversation. So, you've got the intro, you've got the outro, but once you get into it, a podcast is just chatting to someone about something. It's about having a really good, interesting conversation with someone. So, you strip all that stuff back, and that's what it's about. We're all capable of having interesting conversations, or I'd hope that we'd all be fairly confident that we can do that. So that's my golden mantra of podcasting, and I think during some perhaps more difficult times for some of the people that I work with, and I say let's strip it all back and just remember this is just about having great conversations. If we can do that, people will listen. Normally people ask me a bit about, right, okay, that's all brilliant and I love that, but where do I start? It all feels a little bit overwhelming. If I want to go away and start thinking about actually doing this as a serious thing for myself, what's the starting point? People tend to worry about equipment at the beginning, and I get that. It's quite exciting to go away and think, I'm going to buy a new microphone because that's fun. I have an absolute obsession with buying microphones. I've got more than a single human being should ever own. But stuff like that doesn't really matter at this point. That's further down the line. The strategy comes first. In terms of figuring out a bit of a direction, as in, kind of practical thoughts about what could my podcast be about? What could I do? My trick is just think about six episodes. So the people that I work with, I always say, let's just think about these in terms of blocks of 6, whether you release one a week, whether you release a season of 6 and then don't do any for another 6 months or a year, doesn't matter. Just think about a block of 6 episodes to start with. And so think about maybe 6 topics that you could cover. And a good way of doing that is if you think about what are the 6 questions that people ask you the most about your industry, what you do. They're probably 6 really good topics. Might give this some more thought. This might be something that I kind of go down the route of doing. Go in, just have a think about 6 topics that you could cover, 6 questions that you get asked a lot, or 6 people in your network that you could talk to, and that starts to become the kind of the essential bare bones of a plan for a purposeful podcast. Last slide is this. There is a kind of a QR code there that takes you to my digital business card because like an idiot, I've not brought any actual business cards with me today. I don't know if it'll work on that screen. I hope it will do. My other contact details are there anyway. And this, by the way, is my Purposeful podcast. So I'd be a bit of a fraud if I didn't do my own Purposeful podcast. So mine is called Steel City Business. I'm based in Sheffield. It's a podcast all about the business scene in Sheffield. The reason that it's a purposeful podcast, other than the fact that it's talking to business owners about what they do. I think there's an interest there from the kind of the wider business community. But of course, it's businesses that I work with. So it gives me the opportunity to approach businesses to ask them if they'd like to come on my podcast and talk about their business. And at the end of it, a few of them saying, I never really thought about how podcasting might work for us. That's how it's kind of purposeful for me in kind of generating leads and interesting avenues for me. So you can find Steel City Business in any podcast app, just search for it, or the web address steelcity.business if you want to check that out and get a bit of a feel for what I do. If you search for me on LinkedIn, I've got a little pair of headphones next to my name so you can always spot me. Right, that's my kind of little introduction into audio marketing, how it's a little bit different from this overall thought of podcasting. Hopefully 1 or 2 things that might have got you thinking a little bit, but of course I'm more than happy to answer any questions or anything anyone has. Thank you for your time.